So just as we're about to get to the 53-man cut down deadline today, I wanted to look at who were some of the top graded players in the Packers throughout the preseason according to PFF. Now, I had to do a little bit of averaging because the scores weren't out as far as like a total encompassing preseason score. So there's a little bit of variance in some of this, but let's just dive right into it. Starting overall on offense, defense, and special teams, I'll go through who was the highest graded. So maybe a little bit surprising to some people, but Jordan Love ended up essentially being the top rated offensive player this preseason. He scored a 79.5 overall as an offensive score. His first 2 games were better than his last one, but he did finish off that last game. And, some of his score on the offensive side was carried a little bit by some of his ability to run and make plays outside of the pocket. On defense, this one is also a bit surprising. Keshawn Banks was the top-rated defender, grading it at 75.1. And then on teams, Kingsley and Enagbare ended up being the top-graded teams player with a 69.9 grade. On the offensive side, as far as passing went, now some people might think that Clifford had the edge. It ended up being Love. Love scored a 73.6 as far as a passer score went. His last game was his worst graded passing game, but it was just, he had a lot of drops that contributed to that as well. For running, no surprise here, Emmanuel Wilson took the cake as the highest graded runner, grading a 72.5. Receiving, I broke it down by position group. So running back, Taylor ended up grading out as the best receiving option out of the backfield in this one with a 61.7 grade. Romeo Doubs, even though he only played the 2 games, he was outstanding in both of those games. He graded out as a 81.4. That second game, he ended up actually having a 90.4 grade overall for that game alone, which helped contribute to this. He was still in the high 70s for that other grade, though, as well. And then the tight end, Musgrave, was really the only real option that it could have been at tight end. There wasn't a whole lot of production out of either Tucker Kraft or Austin Allen in that aspect. But we'll come back to Austin Allen here in a second. As we get into the blocking grades, run blocking, John Runyon Jr. was the highest grading road blocker at 71.8, and Rasheed Walker, no surprise why he started to get more playing time as the preseason went on, 83.5 with the highest graded pass protection grade. Mentioned we're going to come back to Austin Allen. Looking at his grades as a blocker, I'm more confident in the fact that he's going to make this roster as a blocking tight end alone. So run blocking, he graded out a 70.3. Pretty respectable grade considering John Runyon Jr. scored a 71.8 over that 3-game span. Even in the pass protection kind of game, Austin Allen scored a 68. Not bad numbers for, essentially your number 4 tight end. And his big body and frame really gives him a little bit of an edge on that. So if he can keep his technique about him and continue to develop in that aspect, I think he is an easy choice to be a guy that we bring in on specifically run situations, and he can hold his own in that game. Moving on to the defensive side, though, looking at run defense, again, bringing it down by position. For the defensive line, Carl Brooks was the highest graded run defender with a 65.6. Eric Wilson was the highest linebacker with a 70.8. And Benny Sapp III was the highest defensive back with a 67.7. For pass rush, defensive line, Jonathan Ford was the highest graded pass rusher with a 79.3. And that's really just counting just that strictly those 6 or 7 guys on the defensive line that had pass rush reps. For the edges and the linebacking group, I kind of combined them together, and Kingsley Enagbare was the highest graded linebacker in that group with a 78.9. Obviously, that second game where he had a strip sack and then another sack on top of that heavily weighted his grade, but he was consistent throughout the preseason in his pass rush grade as well. For coverage, linebacker, no surprise, Quay Walker is an outstanding defender when it comes to pass coverage. He scored a 73.4 and was the highest linebacker. Now for cornerback, everybody's probably thinking Valentine is like the obvious option. But in that first game, William Hooper actually outscored him by 1.3 points. He scored a 90.4 in that first game. And while he only played in 2 games, he ultimately averaged out to a 75 grade, which is not great when you think of like 90 to average down to that between 2 games means he scored in the 60s for that other game. But that kind of weighted his score a little bit. So he had a 75.1, which is technically higher than Valentine, but Valentine put it together over 3 games and was a 73.4. That middle game against the Patriots is where he struggled a little bit, had a few more penalties, and kind of was exposed a little bit in that game. On the safety side, Tarvarius Moore was the highest graded. Again, only 2 game sample size as he was injured in this last game, but he scored a 69.6. Benny Sapp was the next highest grade there with a 66.2. Consider, again, like Savage didn't play a whole lot. We had a steady rotation of these guys, and Jonathan Owens really just didn't play all that well as a safety throughout the preseason. So it was really between Sapp and Anthony Johnson Jr., and Anthony Johnson Jr. was only 0.1 behind him. But another thing to consider with some of these grades too was we did have a shortened second game against the Patriots. There were guys that just didn't get a chance to play, similar to like Alex Magoo on the offensive side. Some guys just didn't get a chance to play, and I think that's where like William Hooper didn't have a grade for that game. And then I wanted to look at tackling specifically. From the linebacker position for tackling, Phillips Jr. was the highest graded Packer on that one. And he was really consistent as far as a tackler throughout the preseason. He had a score of 79.3, but all of his scores were within 2 points, up or down from that position. So very steady, very consistent from Phillips Jr. And then Anthony Johnson Jr. as a defensive back had an 80.6 score. For one of the games, Anthony Johnson Jr. just didn't have any reps that they could have counted against him for tackling. So didn't have the opportunity to make a tackle, so he couldn't, be graded one way or another on that. And he was also pretty active on special teams as well. Had a good grade and played a lot of snaps on special teams too. So, really a lot of optimism for me with Anthony Johnson Jr. there. I do think at some point throughout this season, we're going to see Tarvarius Moore and Anthony Johnson Jr. out there at the safety position. It's a little bit of a stretch to think, but just looking at some of these grades and seeing how they performed, I really think the injury to Tarvarius Moore kind of took the opportunity away from him. But at the same time, him being injured gave Johnson Jr. a little bit more of a run with the safeties, and he might be able to capitalize on that moving forward. It's going to take time, but I think that safety room is going to eventually round out, and I do think Moore and Johnson Jr. might be the guys that we stick with for the long haul of the season as it goes on. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Again, these grades were from PFF, not my own grading scale or anything like that. I just did a little bit of averaging there. Some people might think, what about Brenton Cox? He did have a lot of pressures throughout the preseason. Where was he as far as a pass rush grade? His grades were actually a little bit lower than I would have expected him to be. Same with some of the guys on the offensive line for blocking. Like some of them just in one of their games were just low for one reason or another, whether it's penalties or whatnot. Just a lot of variance kind of things. But let me know in the comments below, what do you think of some of these positions, and who surprised you the most from this PFF average grade for the preseason?